He starved in the forest. Then he started eating his own. And the hunger never stopped. Welcome to Shadow Folklore today. The Wendigo. The snow doesn't crunch here anymore. The spruce trees stand black against white, their lower branches heavy and sagging, forming corridors that narrow as you walk deeper. No birds, no squirrels chittering in the high branches, just the occasional crack of wood contracting in the cold, a sound like bone snapping, echoing through the silence. The temperature sits at 20 below 0 Fahrenheit. At this depth of cold, your breath doesn't steam. It crystallizes, hangs in the air for a moment, then falls as tiny particles of ice that catch what little light filters through the canopy. Your eyelashes frost over if you blink too slowly. The skin on your face goes numb first, then your fingers inside their mittens, then the tips of your ears. You learn to recognize the stages. You learn when to turn back. But what if there is no back? What if the winter is too long, the supplies too scarce, the hunting too poor? What if you are 3 weeks into January and the caribou migration never came, and the stored fish ran out before Christmas? And now you are watching the children's faces grow hollow and your own ribs begin to show through your skin. What if the hunger becomes a physical presence in the cabin, a weight in the air, a taste in your mouth that won't go away? No matter how much you chew on boiled leather or scrape the last nutritionless marrow from old bones, what if the hunger becomes something worse than pain? Becomes an intelligence, a voice, a presence that whispers that there is all one food source left. This is where the Wendigo is born, the peoples who have lived in the boreal forests of what are now Canada and the northern United States. The vast belt of spruce, tamarack and frozen muskeg that stretches from Alaska to Labrador have known this entity for centuries, perhaps millennia. The Cree, Ojibwe, Algonquin, Innu, and other Algonquian-speaking nations each have their own names for it, their own accounts, their own warnings. Wendigo, Windigo, Witico, Wihitico. The pronunciation shifts across dialects and distances, but the essential meaning remains: a cannibal spirit, a transformation, a corruption that occurs when a human being crosses the most fundamental taboo of social existence and consumes the flesh of their own kind. The land itself shaped this belief. The boreal forest is a place of extremes, a landscape that offers abundance in summer, fish in every lake and stream, migrating birds by the thousands, berries ripening in the long twilight, and brutal scarcity in winter. The temperature can drop to 40, 50, even 60 below 0 Fahrenheit. Starvation was not a metaphor here. It was a recurring historical reality, a documented cause of death, a known risk of living in a region where the food supply could fail catastrophically if the caribou herds altered their migration routes, if the fish populations crashed, if a winter came early or lasted too long. These were not people who romanticized nature or saw wilderness as a recreational escape. They were people who understood that survival required knowledge, discipline, mutual support, and strict adherence to principles of sharing and reciprocity. The boreal forest could sustain human life, but only if communities remained cohesive, only if individuals subordinated their immediate appetites to the collective good, only if certain lines were never crossed. The Wendigo exists on the far side of that line. In the worldview of the Algonquian peoples, the division between the physical and spiritual realms was not absolute. Spirits inhabited animals, geographical features, weather patterns. Dreams were not mere psychological phenomena, but encounters with real entities in another plane of existence. Humans could be influenced, inhabited, or transformed by spiritual forces, particularly if they violated natural law or fell into states of extreme imbalance. The Wendigo was both a literal danger, the threat of a person driven mad by starvation and resorting to cannibalism, and a spiritual entity, a malevolent force that could possess a person, amplifying their hunger into something infinite and insatiable. The Cree conceptualized it as W Fatikau, a being that embodied W Fatikau Fewin, the act of cannibalism itself, but also a state of selfish excess, a refusal to share, an appetite that grew beyond all natural bounds. The Ojibwe called it Wendigo, describing it as both a monster and a sickness, something that could infect a person's spirit. The very word carries a sense of greed, of consumption without limit, of transformation into something no longer human. To speak of the Wendigo was to speak of a boundary that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. A point of no return where a human being ceased to be part of the community and became instead a threat to it, a predator wearing human shape. This was not superstition in the sense of irrational fear. It was a psychological and social framework for understanding extreme behavior under extreme conditions. A way of processing the fact that people could and did sometimes kill and eat each other when pushed to the edge of survival. The Wendigo belief served as both explanation and deterrent. It said, we know this can happen, we know the temptation exists, and we name it so that we can recognize it, and so that you will understand that if you give in to it, you will become something other than one of us. The entity that emerges from these accounts is not a single standardized creature. Its form varies depending on the teller, the region, the specific tradition, but certain elements recur with striking consistency. The Wendigo is always associated with winter, with cold, with starvation. It is always described as hungry, not merely hungry, but consumed by a hunger that can never be satisfied. Some accounts describe it as growing larger with each person it devours, its appetite expanding in direct proportion to what it consumes, so that it is forever on the edge of starvation, no matter how much it eats. This is hunger as a kind of curse, a spiritual condition rather than a physical state. Physically, descriptions diverge along several lines. In many traditional accounts from Cree and Ojibwe elders, the Wendigo is described as a giant towering 15 feet tall or more, with ash-gray skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its body is emaciated to the point of skeletal visibility. You can count the ribs, see the shape of the skull beneath the face. The eyes are sunken deep into the sockets, but they glow, sometimes described as red, sometimes yellow, sometimes white, like ice catching firelight. The lips are often torn or missing, exposing teeth and gums in a permanent grimace. Some versions describe it as lipless from having chewed off its own mouth in hunger. The Wendigo smells of decay, of rot, of death. Even in the frozen forest, it carries the stench of a corpse, a wrongness that animals can detect from a distance. Its breath is the cold wind that precedes a killing frost. Its heart, if it can be said to have a heart, is sometimes described as a chunk of ice lodged in its chest, impervious to warmth, incapable of melting. Other accounts, particularly those recorded by outsiders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, introduce a different iconography. The Wendigo is a creature with antlers, or the skull of a deer, a stag-headed humanoid that blends human and animal characteristics. This version appears frequently in later retellings and has become dominant in popular culture, though it is worth noting that the deer skull imagery is less consistently present in the oldest recorded oral traditions. Some anthropologists have suggested this may represent a fusion with other regional stories, or a symbolic rendering by non-indigenous illustrators, trying to depict something they heard described but never saw. Our third variant, documented among some Cree communities, describes the Wendigo not as a giant but as an ordinary, looking human, perhaps gaunt, perhaps with a disturbing quality to their eyes or their voice, but outwardly unremarkable. This version emphasizes the idea that the Wendigo transformation is internal first, spiritual before it becomes physical, that a person might walk among you for days, appearing normal while the corruption grows inside them. By the time the physical signs become obvious, it is too late. The spirit has taken hold. Regardless of the form, the Wendigo possesses abilities that mark it as beyond human. It moves through the forest with unnatural speed, gliding over deep snow without sinking, covering distances that should take hours in mere minutes. It can mimic human voices, calling out in the voice of a loved one, a child crying for help, a friend shouting a warning. Those who hear the Wendigo's call and follow it into the forest are never seen again, or are found days later, frozen and partially. The Wendigo is drawn to the scent of human habitation, to the warmth of fires, to the sounds of life. But it also seeks solitude, retreating deep into the forest between attacks. haunting the places where no one goes. Some accounts describe it as unable to enter a dwelling unless invited, a detail that mirrors vampire folklore from other traditions. The idea that the monster requires some act of permission, some breaking of a boundary by the victim themselves. Killing a Wendigo is difficult because it is a spirit as much as a physical being. Ordinary weapons may not suffice. Traditional methods described in oral accounts involve fire, burning the body completely to ash, or sometimes dismemberment followed by fire, ensuring that no piece remains to regenerate. Silver is mentioned in some later accounts, though this may reflect European werewolf traditions bleeding into indigenous narratives through cultural contact. The most reliable protection is not physical but spiritual. Strong community bonds, vigilance for the signs of possession, and immediate intervention if someone begins exhibiting the behavioral markers of Wendigo transformation. Withdrawal, refusal to eat in the presence of others, glassy eyes, muttering about hunger even when food is available. The question of weakness points to the deeper function of the legend. The Wendigo is not a creature you hunt. It is a condition you prevent. The origin of the Wendigo, the transformation narrative that sits at the heart of the legend, is brutally simple. A human being, facing starvation, consumes the flesh of another human being. In that act, they cross a threshold. They become something other than human. They become Wendigo. This is not framed as a mistake or an accident. It is a choice, however desperate, however unthinkable, and the consequences are absolute. The person does not simply survive. They do not return to normal once the famine ends and food becomes available again. The act of consuming human flesh triggers a spiritual transformation that is permanent and degenerative. The individual develops an insatiable craving for human meat. They begin to see other people not as kin, not as community members, but as food. Their humanity erodes. They become a predator. In some versions, the transformation is immediate. The moment the flesh touches their lips, they feel their. In others, it is gradual. A creeping corruption that begins as a guilty secret and grows into obsession, then compulsion, then uncontrollable rage. But the endpoint is always the same, a being that is no longer capable of living among humans, that must be hunted down and killed before it destroys the community. The Wendigo belief functioned as one of the most powerful taboos in Algonquian cultures, a social and psychological bulwark against the breakdown of communal ethics under survival pressure. Anthropologists have documented that in times of severe famine, many cultures worldwide have resorted to cannibalism as a last resort survival strategy. The Algonquian peoples, living in a region where such famines occurred with some regularity, developed not a permissive framework for cannibalism, but an absolute prohibition, backed by the most extreme spiritual consequences imaginable. The message was clear. It is better to die than to eat another person. It is better for your family to die than to consume them. Because if you choose to survive that way, you will not be human anymore. You will be Wendigo, and the community will have no choice but to destroy you. This is a stark ethic, one that might seem harsh to outsiders, but it reflects a profound understanding of social cohesion and the psychological damage caused by violating core moral principles. Communities that experienced cannibalism, even survival cannibalism, even under the most desperate circumstances, often fractured irreparably, trust disintegrated. The survivors could not look at each other without remembering what had been done. The social fabric that held the group together, that made cooperation and mutual aid possible, was torn beyond repair. The Wendigo belief prevented this collapse. It said, "There is a point beyond which we do not go. There is a line we do not cross, no matter what. And if someone crosses it, they are no longer one of us. They have become something else, something that must be stopped." But the Wendigo was not only a warning against cannibalism in the narrow sense, the literal consumption of human flesh. It was also a broader metaphor for selfishness, greed, and consumption without regard for others. The concept of Wendigo extended to describe individuals who hoarded resources during times of scarcity, who took more than their share, who prioritized their own survival over the survival of the group. To act in this way was to exhibit Wendigo-like behavior to begin the spiritual transformation even without literal cannibalism. Basil Johnston, an Ojibwe scholar and writer, explained it this way in his 1995 book, The Manitus, the Spiritual World of the Ojibwe. The Wendigo represented the embodiment of gluttony, greed, and excess. It was never satisfied after killing a person, for it constantly craved more. The creature was a literalization of what happens when appetite becomes disconnected from need, when the drive to consume exceeds all natural limits. This interpretation helps explain why the Wendigo remains psychologically resonant. It is not simply a monster story. It is an exploration of what happens when the social contract breaks down, when individuals prioritize self-interest over collective survival, when the logic of endless consumption overrides the ethics of restraint and reciprocity. In some accounts, a person could become Wendigo, possessed without committing cannibalism, by merely thinking about it too much, by fantasizing about it during a famine, by allowing the idea to take hold in their mind. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between thought and action, between internal state and external behavior. The Wendigo was not just waiting in the forest, it was waiting in the human mind, in the space between hunger and desperation. In the moment when a person begins to rationalize the unthinkable, the transformation could also occur through dreams. A person might dream of eating human flesh and wake to find the craving still present, growing stronger each night until it dominated their waking thoughts. In these cases, the community's shamans or spiritual leaders might intervene, performing ceremonies to drive the Wendigo spirit out before the possession became complete. But these rituals did not always succeed. Sometimes the only recourse was exile, banishing the person from the community before they could act on their impulses, or execution, killing them before they became a full Wendigo. This preemptive killing was not murder in the legal or moral framework of these cultures. It was understood as a form of self-defense, of community protection. The person who exhibited signs of Wendigo possession was already lost. The execution was a mercy to them and a necessity for everyone else. The cultural weight of this belief cannot be overstated. It shaped behavior, governed resource distribution, reinforced the obligations of generosity and sharing that were essential to survival in the harsh northern environment. It gave communities a language for identifying and responding to antisocial behavior before it escalated into violence. And it provided a framework for processing the trauma of those rare cases, when cannibalism did occur, by externalizing the act, attributing it to spirit possession, rather than to the inherent character of the individual, allowing the community to destroy the Wendigo without destroying their belief in the fundamental humanity of their people. When Europeans arrived in North America, they brought with them entirely different frameworks for understanding monsters, madness, and morality. The encounter between indigenous beliefs and colonial worldviews transformed the Wendigo legend in ways that both obscured and amplified. The earliest written references to the Wendigo appear in the Jesuit Relations, the detailed annual reports sent by French Jesuit missionaries in New France, now Quebec and the Great Lakes region, back to their superiors in Europe. These documents, written between 1632 and 1673, provide some of the first European accounts of Algonquian spiritual beliefs, filtered through the theological lens of 17th century Catholicism. Paul Lejeune, a Jesuit priest working among the Montagnais, in the 1630s, recorded accounts of individuals who believed themselves possessed by a cannibal spirit. In his 1636 report, he described a case where a man claimed to have a heart of ice and expressed a compulsion to kill and eat his fellow tribesmen. Lejeune interpreted this as demonic possession in the Christian sense, a manifestation of the devil's influence over pagans who had not yet received the light of the gospel. He did not understand, or did not convey, the cultural logic of the Wendigo belief, the social function it served, the specific environmental and psychological conditions it addressed. This pattern of misinterpretation continued throughout the colonial period. European observers tended to view the Wendigo belief through one of two reductive lenses, either as proof of indigenous savagery and superstition, or as a colorful folk tale, a primitive mythology to be collected and catalogued alongside fairy tales and legends from other primitive cultures. The anthropologist A. Irving Hallowell conducted extensive fieldwork among the Berens River Ojibwe in Manitoba in the 1930s and 1940s, His work represents one of the first serious attempts by a Western scholar to understand the Wendigo belief on its own terms, within the context of Ojibwe cosmology and social structure. In his papers, collected after his death, and published in works like Contributions to Anthropology and Contributions to Ojibwe Studies, Hallowell documented cases of Wendigo-related killings, interviewing elders who remembered incidents from their youth or had heard accounts from earlier generations. Hallowell noted that the Wendigo belief was not a relic of the distant past, but an active element of Ojibwe life well into the 20th century. People genuinely feared it. Communities took the threat seriously, and in cases where someone exhibited signs of Wendigo possession, the response was swift and often fatal. What Hallowell understood, and what many of his contemporaries did not, was that the Wendigo belief could not be separated from the material conditions of life in the boreal forest. This was not abstract mythology. It was a practical response to real dangers: starvation, social breakdown, the psychological stress of prolonged isolation and scarcity. The belief provided a culturally specific language for addressing these dangers, a framework that made sense within Ojibwe ontology and ethics. But even Hallowell's relatively sympathetic approach carried the limitations of his era. He wrote in the language of primitive mentality, pre-logical thought, and magico, religious beliefs, terms that positioned indigenous epistemologies as developmental stages that Europeans had supposedly moved beyond. The implicit hierarchy was clear. We have science, they have superstition. We understand reality, they live in a world of spirits and magic. This colonial framing shaped how the Wendigo entered the broader North American consciousness. It was exoticized, sensationalized, stripped of its social context and moral weight. The creature became a curiosity, a scary story, a symbol of the savage wilderness that civilization was in the process of taming. Newspapers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally reported on Wendigo-related incidents, almost always with a tone of bemused skepticism or outright mockery. When indigenous people claimed to have killed a Wendigo, or to have been attacked by one, white journalists and officials interpreted these claims as evidence of mental illness, superstition, or deliberate fraud. The irony is that these same officials had no trouble believing in demonic possession within their own Christian framework, or in the reality of evil as a spiritual force. But when indigenous people described possession by a cannibal spirit, it was dismissed as primitive delusion. The double standard reflected the broader dynamics of colonialism, the assumption that European ways of knowing were universal and objective, while indigenous ways of knowing were local and subjective. Interesting as ethnographic data, but not to be taken seriously as truth claims. One of the few Europeans who attempted to engage with the Wendigo belief in a more substantive way was Richard Slobodin, an anthropologist who worked among the Gwich'in in the Northwest Territories in the mid-20th century. In his 1960 essay, Some Social Functions of Gwich'in Anxiety, published in the journal American Anthropologist, Slobodin argued that beliefs in malevolent spirits like the Wendigo served important psychological and social functions in communities facing extreme environmental stress. He suggested that such beliefs provided a culturally appropriate outlet for anxiety, a way of naming and managing fears that might otherwise become overwhelming. But even Slobodin's analysis, though more nuanced than most, ultimately positioned the Wendigo belief as a response to stress, rather than as a valid description of reality. The question of whether the Wendigo might be, in some sense, real, not as a biological organism necessarily, but as a genuine spiritual entity within an indigenous ontological framework, was not seriously entertained. This reflects the epistemological imperialism of Western anthropology, the assumption that the scientific worldview is the only valid lens for understanding reality, and that all other worldviews are interesting cultural constructions, but not contenders for truth. What gets lost in this translation is the Wendigo's power as a moral concept. The creature is not simply a boogeyman to frighten children. It is a sophisticated ethical teaching, a warning about the consequences of violating community norms, a reminder that there are fates worse than death. To dismiss it as superstition is to miss the point entirely. The transformation of the Wendigo from cultural belief to criminal evidence occurred most dramatically in a series of documented cases from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. incidents where individuals killed other people while claiming to be possessed by or defending against a Wendigo. These cases offer a window into the collision of indigenous and colonial legal systems, and into the lived reality of a belief that outsiders struggled to understand. The most famous case is that of Swift Runner, a Cree man from the vicinity of Lesser Slave Lake in what is now Alberta. In the spring of 1879, Swift Runner walked into a Northwest Mounted Police post near St. Albert and reported that his wife and 5 children had died of starvation during the previous winter. His story aroused suspicion. He appeared well, fed, and other families in the region had survived the winter without losing anyone to starvation. On May 28, 1879, police accompanied Swift Runner back to his winter camp. What they found was a scene of carnage. The bodies, or rather, the dismembered and partially consumed remains of Swift Runner's wife, brother, mother, and 6 children, not 5, as he had initially claimed, were discovered in and around the camp. Bones had been cracked open for marrow. Skulls had been smashed. The evidence of cannibalism was unmistakable. Swift Runner initially claimed that the family had starved and that he had eaten their bodies after they died. But under interrogation, his story shifted. He began to speak of being possessed by a Wendigo, of a presence that had come over him during the winter, filling him with an insatiable hunger. He described hearing voices, feeling a compulsion he could not resist. He claimed that he had tried to fight it, that he had not wanted to kill his family, but that the Wendigo spirit was too strong. The police and colonial authorities had no framework for understanding this claim. They saw a man who had killed and eaten his family. The question of spirit possession was irrelevant to their legal system. In Saskatchewan, the case was widely reported in Canadian newspapers, usually with lurid headlines emphasizing the cannibalism and the savage nature of the crime. Few reports engaged seriously with Swift Runner's claims of possession. Those that mentioned the Wendigo belief at all treated it as a quaint superstition, a primitive attempt to excuse an act of brutal criminality. But within Cree communities, the case was understood differently. Swift Runner's execution was seen as appropriate, not because he had violated Canadian law, but because he had become Wendigo and needed to be killed to protect the community. The fact that white authorities carried out the execution, even if for different reasons and through different procedures, did not change the fundamental justice of the outcome. A Wendigo had been destroyed. Another case, less well documented but equally revealing, occurred in the region around Cochrane, Ontario, in 1907. A Cree trapper named Jack Fiddler and his brother Joseph were arrested and charged with murder after they killed a woman they believed to be possessed by a Wendigo. Jack Fiddler, who was in his 80s at the time of his arrest, had a reputation as a powerful shaman and Wendigo hunter. Over his lifetime, he claimed to have participated in the killing of at least 14 individuals who had become Wendigo possessed. Fiddler's case posed a direct challenge to colonial authority. He was not a criminal in the eyes of his own people. He was a protector, a spiritual leader who performed a necessary and dangerous service. The killings he carried out were understood within Cree society as acts of defense, no different in moral weight than killing a rabid animal or a raiding enemy. But under Canadian law, these were murders, and Fiddler was a serial killer. He was held in custody in Norway House, Manitoba, awaiting trial. On the 30th of September 1907, he hanged himself in his cell. His brother Joseph was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, though he was released after serving less than 3 years. The Fiddler case highlighted the impossibility of reconciling two fundamentally different legal and moral systems. From the perspective of Canadian law, Jack Fiddler had murdered 14 people and needed to be held accountable. From the perspective of Cree law and ethics, he had performed his duty as a spiritual leader, protecting his community from a genuine threat. Both systems were internally coherent, but they were mutually incomprehensible. What the colonial authorities could not or would not recognize was that the Wendigo belief was not an excuse for murder, but a framework for preventing social collapse. The killings that occurred under this framework were not random or capricious. They followed established protocols, involved consultation with community leaders and elders, and were understood as last resorts when all other interventions had failed. They were acts of collective decision making, not individual violence. The abolition of these practices was framed by Canadian authorities as progress, as bringing the rule of law to lawless regions. But it also represented a profound cultural violence, the imposition of foreign legal concepts that did not account for indigenous ontologies, ethics, or social structures. Communities lost the ability to respond to Wendigo possession within their own frameworks. The belief did not disappear. How could it, when it was rooted in genuine environmental and psychological realities? But the social mechanisms for addressing it were criminalized. A third case, documented in the records of the Ontario Provincial Police, occurred in the winter of 1921 to 1922. A Cree man named Jowuno, Gijigo, Garbo, also known as Jack Fiddler's nephew, though the exact familial relationship is unclear from surviving documents, killed a woman in his camp, whom he identified as Wendigo possessed. He then turned himself in to police, explaining that he had fulfilled his duty and was prepared to accept whatever judgment the white authorities would impose. The case never went to trial. Jowuno, Gijigo, Galbo died in custody under circumstances that remain unclear, possibly from illness, possibly from suicide, though some accounts suggest he may have been killed by other prisoners or guards. The documentation is fragmentary, filtered through multiple layers of translation and colonial record, making it difficult to reconstruct what actually happened. What these cases collectively demonstrate is that the Wendigo belief was not a relic of the past or a metaphorical teaching. It was an active, functioning element of indigenous law and social order, well into the 20th century. People genuinely believed in the reality of Wendigo possession. They genuinely believed that individuals could transform into cannibalistic monsters, and they acted on these beliefs in ways that brought them into fatal conflict with colonial authorities. The question of whether any of these individuals were actually possessed by a Wendigo, or whether they were suffering from mental illness, from starvation, induced psychosis. Western psychiatry has proposed the concept of Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome characterized by delusions of transformation, intrusive thoughts about cannibalism, and homicidal or suicidal impulses. But this diagnosis itself reflects a Western bias, the assumption that beliefs about spirit possession are by definition delusional, that the Wendigo cannot be real in any meaningful sense. From an indigenous perspective, the question is not whether the Wendigo is real. Of course it is real as any other spiritual entity, but rather how to recognize it, how to protect against it, and how to respond when someone becomes possessed. The reality of the Wendigo is a given, but what kinds of entities exist in the world and how we know what we know. Colonial authorities imposed their ontology through force, through arrests, trials, executions, the criminalization of indigenous spiritual practices. The Wendigo did not disappear when this happened. It simply became unspeakable within official discourse, a secret held within communities, a belief practiced in the shadows of an imposed legal order. The Wendigo entered popular culture slowly, first as a footnote in anthropological texts and sensationalized newspaper accounts, then as a creature available for appropriation by writers and filmmakers, looking for fresh monsters to terrify audiences. This transformation, from culturally specific belief to generic horror trope, has accelerated dramatically in the past few decades, producing a version of the Wendigo that is often unrecognizable from its roots. The creature's first significant appearance in American literature came in Algernon Blackwood's 1910 short story, The Wendigo, published in the collection The Lost Valley and Other Stories. Blackwood was a British author known for his supernatural fiction, and he encountered accounts of the Wendigo while researching Canadian folklore for his work. His story follows a group of hunters in the northern Canadian wilderness who encounter something vast and terrifying that drives one of them mad. Blackwood's Wendigo is atmospheric and ambiguous, more a presence than a physical creature, associated with vast distances, cosmic cold and psychological dissolution. It calls to its victims in a voice like wind through trees, drawing them away from the safety of the campfire into the wilderness, where they are transformed or consumed in ways that remain unclear. The story captures something of the Wendigo's essential horror, the idea of being drawn into emptiness, of losing one's humanity to hunger and isolation, but it also abstracts the creature away from its cultural context. Blackwood's Wendigo could be anywhere, haunting any wilderness, stripped of its specific connection to Algonquian cultures and the boreal forest environment. This pattern of abstraction and appropriation continued throughout the 20th century. The Wendigo appeared sporadically in pulp magazines, anthology collections, and regional folklore compilations. It was the thing in the woods, the winter demon, the cannibal spirit. Scary, yes, but emptied of its moral and social meaning. In 1983, the Wendigo made a significant leap into popular consciousness with its inclusion in the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. The game's monster manual presented the Wendigo as a powerful creature with the ability to control weather and invoke fear, depicted with the now familiar deer skull and antlers. This visual iconography, which, as noted earlier, is not consistently present in the oldest oral traditions, became standardized through Dungeons and Dragons and subsequent fantasy gaming properties. The deer skull Wendigo is now so ubiquitous that many people assume it is the traditional form, unaware that this imagery may have been elaborated or introduced by non-indigenous illustrators. Stephen King incorporated Wendigo-like elements into his 1983 novel Pet Sematary, though he uses the Algonquian term Wendigo only sparingly, preferring to evoke the concept through atmosphere and imagery rather than explicit naming. The novel's setting in rural Maine, its themes of death and resurrection, and the violation of natural boundaries, its suggestion of an ancient malevolent force inhabiting the forest. All of these draw on the Wendigo tradition, even if King's creature is not called by that name. The 2000s saw an explosion of Wendigo appearances across multiple media platforms. The television series Supernatural, which ran from 2005 to 2020, featured a Wendigo as the monster of the week in its second episode. The show depicted it as a fast-moving predator that hibernates for years between feeding cycles, vulnerable to fire. This version emphasized the creature's physical threat over its spiritual or moral dimensions. It was a monster to be hunted and killed, not a cautionary tale about community ethics. The video game, The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt, released in 2015, includes a Wendigo-like creature called a Leshen, a forest spirit with antlers and control over animals. While not explicitly called a Wendigo, the game draws on Slavic rather than Algonquian folklore. The visual and thematic similarities are clear, suggesting the degree to which the deer skull forest monster has become a generic trope, detached from its specific cultural origins. Until Dawn, a 2015 survival horror video game, made the Wendigo central to its plot. Set in a remote mountain lodge, the game revealed that the cannibalistic monsters stalking the protagonists were humans who had been transformed after resorting to cannibalism when trapped by a mining disaster. The game's Wendigos are fast, skeletal, eyeless creatures with superhuman strength, visually striking and terrifying, but bearing little resemblance to traditional accounts beyond the basic concept of cannibalism. Triggered transformation. The Hunger Games trilogy by Suzanne Collins, published between 2008 and 2010, includes a creature called a mutt, or mutation in Mockingjay, the final novel that exhibits Wendigo-like characteristics, specifically wolf-like beasts with disturbingly human features, including the eyes and voices of dead tributes, created by the Capitol as weapons. While not called Wendigos, these creatures evoke the same horror, the human transformed into something monstrous and predatory, the violation of boundaries between human and animal, the idea of consumption and being consumed. What all of these adaptations share is a focus on the Wendigo as a physical monster, a creature to be fought or fled. The cultural context, the taboo against cannibalism, the social function of the belief, the moral weight of transformation, is either minimized or absent entirely. The Wendigo becomes another entry in the bestiary of horror, distinguishable from vampires or werewolves, or zombies primarily by its visual design, and its association with winter and wilderness. This is not to say that these adaptations are necessarily disrespectful, or that they have no value. Horror fiction and games serve important psychological functions, allowing audiences to explore fear in controlled environments, to confront the possibility of transformation and dissolution. The Wendigo, with its themes of hunger, isolation, and the loss of humanity, is a powerful vehicle for these explorations. But something is lost in the translation. The Wendigo of popular culture is often stripped of its indigenous context, presented as a universal monster, rather than as a culturally specific belief arising from particular environmental and social conditions. The creature's ability to serve as a critique of greed, excess, and the violation of community norms, the aspects that gave the original legend much of its power, is diluted when the Wendigo becomes simply another thing that jumps out in the dark. A few creators have attempted more culturally grounded approaches. The 2019 video game The Outer Worlds includes a quest involving a creature that locals call a Wendigo, and the quest's resolution emphasizes community cooperation and resource sharing over simple monster hunting. The 2021 novel The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, while not explicitly about Wendigos, draws deeply on indigenous horror traditions and the idea of the past returning to demand accountability, evoking the Wendigo's moral dimension even without naming it directly. These exceptions suggest that it is possible to engage with the Wendigo tradition in ways that honor its origins, while still creating compelling contemporary narratives. But they remain exceptions. The dominant trend has been toward abstraction, appropriation, and the gradual erosion of the creature's cultural specificity. The question of who gets to tell Wendigo stories and how has become increasingly fraught. Indigenous writers and artists have pointed out that the casual use of the Wendigo in horror fiction and games constitutes a form of cultural appropriation, the taking of a culturally specific belief, often sacred or sensitive, and using it for entertainment and profit without regard for its original meaning or context. The Wendigo is not a generic monster. It belongs to specific peoples and traditions, and its use by outsiders can be seen as a continuation of the colonial project of extraction and exploitation. At the same time, the Wendigo has escaped its origins and become part of the broader North American cultural imagination. It appears in anthologies and games and films, recognized by millions of people who could not name a single Algonquian nation or locate the boreal forest on a map. The creature has been transformed, appropriated, and recontextualized, to the point where the popular image bears only a superficial resemblance to traditional accounts. This is what happens to monsters when they are taken from their cultural homes and circulated in global markets. They become commodities, malleable signifiers that can be reshaped to fit whatever narrative or aesthetic purposes their users require. The Wendigo of popular culture is no longer a warning about the consequences of violating community norms. It is a jump scare, a level boss, a visual design element. It is whatever the market needs it to be. But the original Wendigo, the creature of Algonquian belief, the transformation that occurs when hunger and isolation drive a person beyond the boundaries of the human. That Wendigo remains still told in the communities that created it, still functioning as a teaching, still understood as a real danger that requires vigilance and response. The two versions exist in parallel now: the appropriated Wendigo of popular culture and the living Wendigo of indigenous tradition. They are not the same creature, even if they share a name. If the Wendigo was born from the environmental and social conditions of the boreal forest, from the reality of famine, the temptation of cannibalism, the need to maintain community cohesion in the face of extreme scarcity, what does one answer is that the Wendigo has always been about more than literal cannibalism. It has always been, at its core, a story about insatiable appetite, about consumption that exceeds all natural limits, about the transformation that occurs when a person or a society prioritizes short-term survival or gratification over long-term sustainability and social health. Seen through this lens, the Wendigo becomes a metaphor for late capitalism, for an economic system predicated on endless growth, endless consumption, endless extraction. The modern corporation is Wendigo. Like in its appetites, it must grow or die, must consume markets and resources and labor without limit, can never be satisfied, no matter how much it devours. The larger it grows, the hungrier it becomes. Its heart is ice. The environmental crisis amplifies this reading. Climate change is driven by consumption patterns that mirror the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. The burning of fossil fuels, the clear cutting of forests, the extraction of minerals and metals and water at rates that far exceed natural replenishment. We are, collectively, eating our own future, consuming the resources that our children and grandchildren will need to survive. We know this, we see it happening, And yet we cannot stop. The Wendigo legend says, there is a point beyond which consumption becomes spiritual corruption, beyond which you cannot turn back. We may have already crossed that line. Indigenous activists and scholars have explicitly made this connection. The Wendigo serves as a traditional concept that illuminates the pathologies of modern extractive capitalism. Winona LaDuke, an Anishinaabe economist and environmentalist, has written about the Wendigo in the context of resource extraction in indigenous territories. The strip mines, the clear cuts, the pipelines that violate treaty rights and destroy ecosystems in the service of corporate profit. She describes these corporations as operating under a Wendigo economics, a system of thought that treats the natural world as an infinite resource to be consumed, that refuses to recognize limits or reciprocity. From this perspective, the horror of the Wendigo is not that it might appear in the forest and kill you. The horror is that we have all become Wendigo, that our society is structured around Wendigo principles, that we have normalized a level of consumption and waste that our ancestors would have recognized immediately as a form of madness. The Wendigo transformation was triggered by eating the flesh of one's own kind. What are we doing when we consume the ecosystems that sustain us? When we burn the carbon-dense deposits that took millions of years to form? When we poison the water we drink and the air we breathe, in order to maintain economic systems that concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands? Are we not, in some sense, eating ourselves? The Wendigo's hunger was infinite precisely because it had violated the fundamental principle of balance. The more it consumed, the larger it grew, and the larger it grew, the hungrier it became. There was no satisfaction possible, no point at which the appetite would be sated. This is the logic of growth. Based capitalism, expand or die, consume or be consumed, accumulate without end. The traditional response to a Wendigo was community action, recognition of the threat, collective decision making, and, when necessary, the difficult act of stopping the consumption by destroying the Wendigo itself. Translating this to the modern context suggests that addressing our current crises requires collective action, a willingness to recognize the pathology of endless growth, and perhaps most difficult of all, a readiness to dismantle the systems that embody Wendigo logic, even when those systems are deeply embedded in our social structures and personal identities. But the Wendigo legend also offers a kind of warning about the dangers of this fight. Those who hunted Wendigos risked becoming possessed themselves. The violence required to stop a Wendigo, the necessity of killing what was once human, could corrupt the hunter. Jack Fiddler's long career as a Wendigo killer suggests the psychological toll of this work. How do you take a life, even in defense of the community, without being changed by it? How do you look into the face of the monster and not see yourself reflected there? These questions resonate in our current political moment, when movements for social and environmental justice must grapple with questions of tactics, of purity, of how to dismantle oppressive systems without reproducing their logic. The Wendigo hunter's dilemma is the revolutionary's dilemma. How to fight the monster without becoming monstrous. The Wendigo endures because it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, the tension between individual survival and collective good, the possibility of moral transformation and corruption, the terror of appetites that exceed our control. It is one of the most psychologically disturbing creatures in North American mythology, precisely because it is not alien. The Wendigo is us, or what we can become. The monster is not waiting in the forest. It is waiting in the space between hunger and desperation, between want and need, between restraint and excess. And that space is always present. It doesn't matter if you live in a boreal forest facing a subsistence crisis, or in a city facing a climate crisis. The fundamental question remains: what are you willing to do to survive? What lines will you cross? At what point does the drive for self-preservation transform into something that devours everything around you, including yourself? The Wendigo says, there is a point of no return. There is a transformation that once begun cannot be undone. There is a hunger that can never be satisfied. The question we face individually and collectively is whether we can recognize that transformation beginning in ourselves and in our systems, and whether we can muster the will to stop it before it becomes complete. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.